Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the World War II Daily Podcast. Today, we have a very different format than we are used to. We're not doing an interview with a single person, but we have two people here. Kaluven the British, or Kevin, who's a YouTuber and a gamer. And we have, again, with us, Waitman Beorn, a person who has an academic background, has written books, and is an Army veteran. I want to start this show inviting you to support us on Patreon. Now we have a Patreon. The link will be in the description of the episode. And if you want daily World War II content, you can follow me and Samuel on Instagram at World War II underscore daily and at Samuel.decorti. All right. So this episode was inspired by episode 7, which was divided in two parts, one with Bourne and one with David Harrisville. Um, and we've been thinking a lot about it, me and Samuel. We've been thinking a lot about bringing this topic back, the myth of the clean hands, and associate it with other areas of knowledge, such as um, yeah, and YouTube. Um, so I watched Kevin's video a couple of weeks ago, and the link to this video, playing with the baddies, is going to be in the description of this episode. So you please check out the video and subscribe to Kevin's channel. And then we decided to put Kevin and Bourne together to talk about the myth of the clean hands with us. Before we go to this conversation, I want to ask Waitman, if you want to talk about your recent projects, what you're doing now, or any other relevant information would like to bring to the show about yourself, please.
Sure. Yeah. Really briefly. I'm an historian of the Holocaust. I teach at Northumbria University in Newcastle in the UK. My first book was on the German Army and the Holocaust in Belarus. So very much looking at the lowest levels on the ground, at sort of company level formations. What the German Army, what the Wehrmacht is actually doing to sort of further the Holocaust, which I think is probably relevant for this conversation. My second book was Holocaust in Eastern Europe. It's a more general reader if you really want to get a focus on the Holocaust in that particular geographic location. And I just published a book last August called Between the Wires, the Ionovska camp and the Holocaust in Lviv. And it's about a very little known concentration camp in Lviv in Ukraine that you all should definitely find out about. It's really, really important in all kinds of different ways. I also, as has been mentioned, I'm an Army veteran. I went to West Point, the U.S. Military Academy. I was in Iraq from 03 to 04 during the invasion as a cavalry officer, and as a scout platoon leader and a squadron operational planner, which I guess is potentially relevant in some way, shape, or form to this conversation. And I guess I would call myself a gamer. I'm not a professional by any stretch, much more of an amateur in that world. But I definitely enjoy all kinds of different games. But in research for this episode, I've been playing the Call of Duty World War II version. And I really do, just to give a plug for a game that does this right, not to jump ahead of things, but Sniper Elite is one of my all-time favorites because literally all you do is go around plugging Nazis, which I think is doing it the right way around. But yeah, so I'm looking forward to this conversation and hope we can lend some light onto this topic.
Awesome. All right. I would like to say that I'm a huge fan of Men of War Assault Squad 2 as well. I play it a lot. And the Ostfront Gates of Hell, I played a lot as well. And when we started to talk about it, I was like, let's talk about like the myth of the clean hands and having this moral issue in games in general. My mind got a little messed. But anyways, let's continue. Kevin, I would like to ask you the same thing, like introduce yourself, tell us who you are, but I would like to listen from you, like what inspired you to do that video and how was the process of creating it? Because that's the video that sparked the idea for this episode. So I think it's extremely relevant for us to understand like where that came from. And before you answer, I would like to say that Calvin has like his channel is not only a gaming channel. He puts a lot of insights in games and like the way they are made. It's a very good channel. So be sure you subscribe. All right, Kevin, please.
Okay, well, I'm Kevin or Kaluven. I have zero academic background whatsoever, no military experience. I'm a computer programmer that happens to like games and is really interested in the Second World War. So that's my rough background. I mean, I'm really, at the core, I'm a strategy gamer. So although I have played lots of other things like first person shooters in the past, mainly the focus is strategy. So I started my channel because man needs a hobby and I like talking about strategy games. And I don't so much care about showing people me playing strategy games. I think that would be boring. So what I generally do is talk about strategy games, what's good, what works, what doesn't, and also about the creation process, publishing, just kind of the topics that you won't get from just watching or playing a game yourself. And I guess the idea came to me because, as I said, I'm an amateur historian or history enthusiast anyway. And I found myself replaying a game called Company of Heroes just because I wanted to replay it because it's a really, really good strategy game. And I just, I found myself continually bewildered by a lot of the direction. And I stopped writing the video about that I was going to make and instead started to look at how the Axis forces are portrayed and really why is that way and why that had to be that way when it probably didn't. So that got me in the design process of the video. I just kind of wrote the thing in a couple of evenings, really. I just sort of I started at the top and then I went back over it because I wanted to hammer a few points home because some of my audience are quite young. I mean, not all of them, but some of them are young and they don't have, they're not the kind of people that would have done any study. They know, like I said, that Nazi Germany was the baddies, but they don't know any more than that. And the problem is there's a lot of wars and there's a lot of baddies. And I think I was worried people would get confused because it's a lot of cases it's not clear cut. But in the Second World War, I believe it kind of is, in the broad strokes. So I kind of wanted to set the scene and then make a video, and then I uploaded it, and my usual subscriber base of a couple of thousand people watched it, and then I forgot about it. And then 5 weeks later, out of nowhere, it suddenly had 70 odd thousand views, and I had 1,500 of comments that ranged between the pleasing and frustrating is probably the most polite way to describe them. So that's me. Like I said, my knowledge of history is, I mean, there's lots I don't know about the Second World War. Huge, huge swathes of knowledge which are missing in my brain. But I try not to comment on stuff I don't understand, and I do read up when I don't. So yeah, I felt confident enough in what I was saying that I was confident enough in my own comments, and thought maybe I'd even put out a follow up video to that one. But hey, that's not happened yet.
Well, and let me just jump in to say that as someone who does this professionally, Kevin does a really good job of distilling a lot of sort of difficult and complex history in that video. It's really good. So I mean, definitely give yourself some credit. It was
Thank
really
you.
solid.
Yeah, it's a really good video. I thought like I sent Kevin some material afterwards, like when we were talking on Discord already, and I was surprised that he hadn't read like some of the materials I had that actually I was like, okay, where did that came from? It's a very, very, very good video, man. Well, I think that for us to start, Waitman, can you explain us a little bit about what is the myth of the clean hands again? We learned about it on episode 7, which I invite all of you to watch it again. But I think it's important for us to start from the beginning.
Sure. I mean, this as you as you say, this could be a whole episode, so I'm not going to do that. Um, and essentially, the clean Wehrmacht myth is the idea that the German army, German military in general, um, was just a conventional military force that was fighting a war that was somehow completely divorced and hermetically sealed from all of the other crimes, atrocities, um, genocidal projects of the Nazi state, and that they were just fighting off really the Soviets, right? Because the Germans rarely play up the fact that they were fighting the Americans and the British. It's really that they were defending Germany from the evil hordes of communists. And as I said in the other episode, the Soviets are not evil, but certainly they did carry out a program of mass and almost systematic rape and various kinds of crimes as they entered Germany, which just adds another sort of layer of emotion to the clean Wehrmacht myth and to the idea that this is what they were fighting against, and therefore um, they're clean. Um, the myth is generated first and foremost by the German generals themselves, who are allowed to sort of tell these very sanitized tales and stories about their fighting, which sort of just glorifies the fighting and doesn't touch on all the other aspects of that. The Allies, the Western Allies in particular, were guilty of this in an interest of wanting to know how to fight the Soviets and not really being too particular about the ways in which that's depicted. And so the classic example of this is von Manstein's memoirs, which are entitled "Lost Victories." Right? And the idea that a Nazi general who is deeply implicated in all the crimes of the Nazi state could then publish a book and entitled "Lost Victories," as if that's like, oh my gosh, that's the what we almost got it, when the almost getting it is plunging all of Europe into a mass genocide, is kind of crazy. And this myth uh, really it carries on in the public. I mean, there have been lots of hacks taken out of it by academics like myself, but lots of other folks before me. Um, so I think in the academic sense, nobody really believes this anymore. In the public sense, I think it can be very much up for grabs. There was a really interesting and important moment in the '90s where there was the so-called Wehrmacht exhibition, which traveled around Germany and Austria, and literally gave specific examples from soldier letters, diaries, photographs, et cetera, of the fact that the German army was deeply complicit in all these ways in the Holocaust, and that caused lots of consternation in the German and Austrian public because many of them hadn't been confronted in this way. And one of the, I think, reasons why the myth itself is so enduring is that unlike the SS, particularly the Allgemeine SS, the sort of camp SS, there were 17 million Germans that served in the Wehrmacht over the course of World War II. And that means if you start saying that the Wehrmacht is a criminal organization that um, particularly furthered the Nazi genocide, now you're hitting very, very close to home because everybody in Germany um, has, and particularly earlier on, had living relatives, sons, fathers, uncles, brothers, who had served in the Wehrmacht, and so now you're not just claiming that the SS are bad, you're also claiming that these people are bad as well. And of course, there is the challenge that some of them, many of them, were conscripted, and so there's that aspect of it too. Um, but just to recap, because I don't want to go on to a long academic sort of discussion, we can talk about various points as we go forward. But the Clean Wehrmacht myth is this idea that the German military was honorable, whatever that means, and only fought a war against conventional forces um, and to defend Germany almost reluctantly in a certain sense, and was not complicit in all the different ways in which the Nazis committed war crimes, mass atrocities, and genocide.
Perfect. All right, Samuel, do you wanna start it with the? Can you hear me? I think your microphone's off.
So what's interesting is that under Kaluven's videos, there's a lot of comments, and some of these comments agree with the video, but there's also a few comments that are trying to engage with the content of the video. They can disagree with one aspect, or they can disagree with the entire aspect. We've selected a couple of these comments, and we would like to go over them one by one. And one of the first ones that really popped up is that it's a comment which says, well, if you're going to include the actions of a small portions of Germans during World War II, then you need to do the same for the Japanese. They did just as much horrible stuff as Germany. You'd have to do the same one for one of the good guys because the Soviets raped and pillaged their way to Berlin. And this is the first comment that we have selected. What do you think about it?
Who wants to go first?
Well, I mean, I'll give you the amateur answer first, and I think it's I think it's a comment based on a lack of understanding of scale. I mean, I know my knowledge of the Pacific campaign is limited, but I do know that the Japanese were responsible for some awful atrocities. But I think that there's two aspects here. I think the first aspect is comparing the scale of the Nazi actions against the Japanese is just wrong. Not just on because although the Japanese committed a lot of their own atrocities in China even before the start of the Second World War, I think the problem is it's one of industrial scale essentially, and whereas the atrocities committed by Nazi Germany were severely limited by the fact that they lost, and they actually planned to go far bigger. And I think the other thing is it's one of those comments that it tries to just excuse one terrible action with another. And I don't think that, I think that's kind of like a deflection defense that I don't think holds a lot of water, because of course, you know, the Soviets are responsible. Every combatant nation had some war crimes. They were on different levels, they were on different scales, but none of them excuse none of them excuse each other. Like the actions of one of the Free French units in Italy was appalling, with the amount of rape and pillaging that they did around the Battle of Monte Cassino. But that doesn't make anything else better or worse, and they're all terrible. And I think my problem with that sort of comment is when you make a video specifically about a game that specifically features Nazi Germany, of course, you're just going to talk about Nazi Germany. And if the game had featured Imperial Japan, or had featured the USSR, or had featured the Allies in Sicily and Italy, then maybe those stories would be talking about too. But from a game perspective, I think, you know, it's just like any media. If you're making a story about one small slice of media, you can't go and tell all the stories of anything related to it. So, yeah, my main problem with that comment is just one of context, I guess. Of course, other things are terrible, but that doesn't excuse none of that excuses any actions of the Wehrmacht at all, not in the slightest.
Well, and I would add that I would double down on it and say, absolutely, you shouldn't play as the Japanese either, because the Japanese committed a mass genocide in China. The fact that very, very few people know about it doesn't negate the fact that they killed hundreds and hundreds of thousands, millions of people. They were chopping off heads of women and children as a competition that was published in newspapers back in Japan. They had a Unit 731 that was literally using the Chinese population as guinea pigs in biological weapons experiments. And so yeah, I would say you shouldn't probably play them either as a playable. I think all the criticisms that Kevin has sort of levied against games and the way they portray the Wehrmacht, I think, are probably just as relevant for Imperial Japan. And I think one of the distinctions, I think this is something that Kevin was kind of hinting at. It's not so much the, excuse me, not so much the scale, but it's the organizational buy-in. So for both the Nazis and to a lesser extent the Japanese, their worldview is a racist worldview in which some people deserve to live and some don't, based on their viewed inferiority, right? And so as a system, systematically, the Nazis in particular, but the Japanese also in the way they treated, particularly non-Western Asian populations like the Koreans, etc. They carried that out, and therefore the militaries that are fighting to spread Nazism and sort of the imperial Japanese colonial mindset are directly contributing to spreading not only that ideology but the impacts of that, which are mass killing and genocide, in a way that the Soviet Union is not. Right? I will certainly not excuse the mass rapes of women in Germany. I don't think anybody would, and I think Kevin's 100% correct that we could all say, well, what about this happened? That's also bad. That's not really a great rhetorical strategy. But the Soviet Union, communism, as an ideology, is neither racist nor genocidal. The way that Stalin, carried it out, yes, absolutely, he killed lots of folks, and he was responsible in large part for the genocide, the mass starvation in Ukraine, et cetera, et cetera. But as an institution, as a system, communism is not based on genocide. And so the spreading of communism, while I don't support it, I'm not a communist, and it may lead to the changes in the way societies function. it's not there, at least as an ideology, to murder people. And so I think that's an important distinction. It's not to say that the Soviet Union was cuddly and kind and gentle, but even in those conversations, I think there's probably some important distinctions in terms of making them playable and whether you are sort of treading on all of those intricate issues that Kevin talks about in this video when you play the Soviets versus when you play the Germans. Because there were a large number of people that were actually quite happy to see the Soviets arrive, if their choice was the Nazis or the Soviets. And so I agree with the comment already that this is kind of whataboutism that's not super helpful, because it's in many ways apples to oranges. The Americans committed war crimes as well in World War II, but they were exceptions to the rule rather than policy. And I think that's the important distinction, to put it in sort of a nutshell. When the Americans committed war crimes, it's news because we don't commit war crimes, generally speaking, certainly in World War II. Whereas the Nazis, that was the order of the day, literally.
Yeah. Do you know what comes to my mind, Samuel, when we talk about this kind of argument? Dresden, all the time. Like, yeah, Cologne. Like every time you post something about German war crimes, people come in the comments and they say, "Ah, what about Dresden? What about this? What about that?" Yeah, okay. It doesn't actually counter. It just shows another bad thing. But yeah,
Mhm.
okay, very
That
good.
also reminds me, because there
Let
was
me
another
move on to
comment.
the. Go ahead.
That reminds me, there was another comment that actually zoomed in on the fact that Kevin is British, and it said that the fact that a British guy is calling all Germans bad, yet forgets his own history and atrocious acts committed by the British, especially during the colonial era. And I think this is again a deflection because it zooms in on, oh, you're British, so everything you say is invalid. But what do you guys think of it?
Well, I've never colonized any African nation myself, so I don't count myself guilty of any of this. And I think it's just one of those utterly stupid arguments. I didn't even call all Germans bad. I'm very careful that I say Nazi Germany when I'm talking about the Second World War because, it, there's some really, really good German historians out there who are very critical of Nazi Germany, and they're just as their viewpoints are just as valid as anyone. And I think it's one of those double questions, those double comments, because firstly, it makes a stupid comparison, as if someone who is from a nation can't criticize another nation, which is just, that means none of us could ever criticize anyone about anything ever if that was true. And the second thing is comparing, this is a really nuanced point, but comparing the British Empire to the Nazi Germany's idea of empire, they couldn't be more different. I mean, the British Empire would try and move in with its own a bit of military, but mostly a bit of backstabbing and politics and, paying off tradespeople and using very underhand techniques. And then they would try and build up their illegitimate conquest, and they would try and make it productive. And yeah, there'd be rebellions and they'd be brutally crushed with some horrific policy, but it was a long-term investment to bring Britain wealth over time. Whereas Nazi Germany, if they didn't really care about the territory, they would just rob it. Absolutely blind, take everything. And if they did want it, they would try and exterminate everyone that lived there and move in their own settlers. So, from a double point of view, I mean, when you compare the completely unexcusable British Empire with what the Nazi Germany's, but I mean, the whole General Plan East isn't, that's not empire building. That's extermination and recolonization, right? I mean, that was essentially the plan. And yes, I know that they never found one exact document with all the proof in, but I've seen some of the, I've seen the agricultural plan that they did survive, and the pretty little hand drawn graphs and the guesses that there'll be 3 million people in this region now, even though there was already 7 there, and no explanation of where the other 4 went. And so, yeah, I think it's just one of those questions by people that just they don't understand, they don't want to have a serious argument, I guess, is my real feeling, because I don't think that either of those methods of thinking would stand up against, 5 seconds of scrutiny.
Well, I think, I mean, just to support that in a certain sense, I mean, the Nazis, in writing, multiple people in writing said they expected between 30 and 40 million Eastern Europeans to die as a direct result of the Green Plan and the Hunger Plan, this Genau Plan Ost. So I mean, and there's over 10,000 pages of documentation that hasn't even really been looked at yet. This is settled history. It's not at all controversial. But I also think, that's not the gaming genre that Kevin's looking at. If there was a game that was Conquer Africa, then maybe we would be having, and we should be having, the conversation about what it's like to play the British or what it's like to play the French, because the game would then force us, right? Because there might be, if it was a tactical or strategic game, there might be like, how do you starve the population, or how do you control the population? Or if it's the Americans, how do you drive the Native Americans off their land? But we're not having that conversation because that's not the game that we're looking at.
Mm.
And I think that did those games exist in that sense, then that's a relevant comment to make. Should we be playing the British as colonizers? Should we be playing the Americans as colonizers? I think that's an absolutely fair question. But in this sense, it just seems like misdirection by somebody who isn't, as Kevin pointed out, isn't really willing or able to have that conversation. And I guess in the British sense in particular, I would also say that, I think, imperialism is very, very bad and has been. And imperialism and colonialism are two different things, but they're often conflated. And in some places, imperial powers are also colonial powers, which means they want to settle the land. They want to drive people off the land. They want them to die in large numbers. But sometimes there are imperial powers in which they want to control, either for military strategic purposes or for economic purposes, land. And as Kevin pointed out already, that they're not particularly concerned about what the impacts are on the indigenous people that live there. But we've seen in Australia, New Zealand, British/Australians have done really horrible things, genocidal things. But again, that's not the context. The context is World War II, and the fact that Britain or the United States or France, has legitimately done terrible things 100 years ago. I don't think is a legitimate reason to say that you shouldn't play that particular side, because we can all, given a story in 5 minutes, and I can go back into the history of any country or any organization and find something horrible that they've done in the past. But it's not, it's not super relevant, I think, in this context, because then it's okay, we shouldn't play anything. I mean, that's sort of if you want to, and then, maybe you take that point, but at some point, I recognize that we're living in reality, and we can't just outlaw all games that involve playing as a national power because that national power has done something bad. But I don't think it's in any way balanced to sort of say, well, you shouldn't play as the British in World War II because the British did horrible things in South Africa or during the Zulu Wars or in India or wherever else they legitimately did horrible things. I mean, like, if we were simulating, and Hearts of Iron is a good example of that, I suppose, which we're not going to talk about, I suppose, in this context. But there are games where you do play throughout those time periods as colonial imperial powers, and I think that does deserve conversation about how that's done, and deserves careful thought by game designers about how they present that. But again, that's beyond the scope of this context.
Yeah. All right. Do you want to say something, Samuel?
No, I think
No?
it's a typical ad hominem argument. It's like, you're British, you're not allowed to say anything about this, and yeah, that's not a way to have this conversation.
None of us would be able to talk about this issue, like Waitman said. So yeah. So the next comment, it's an interesting one, because it brings another line of thinking about the topic. It says, "I see where you are coming from, but at a point we just got to sit back and realize it's just a game and nothing more." Is
Yeah, I
it
mean,
just a
this one.
game?
So this is one that I have really strong feelings on, because on the one hand, and I think we've covered this already to a certain extent, I don't expect you to be learning history through video games. I mean, and again, this is me being a nerdy academic, I suppose, but I'd much rather you read books written by people that have done the research than try to draw your own conclusions about complex historical events um, through video games. But, and this is a big but, when it comes to popular wisdom, conventional wisdom, popular understandings of the past, I think video games play a really important role, and reach a much larger audience than my books do, or even popular historians' books, or and so it is important to consider the ways in which big strokes of history are presented. Um, and if you come away from a World War II game, as Kevin points out really well in his video, if you're really happy because you threw the Allies into the sea at Normandy, you need to sit with that for a second and think about, what does that mean? I mean, what are the implications of that, and who are the people that you are essentially taking on the role of? I mean, because when you play these video games, whether it's a first person shooter, or a large level strategy game, or this kind of middle ground like Company of Heroes, where you're kind of at the tactical level, so you're kind of moving vehicles and squads around. I mean, you are in a certain sense becoming that group. That's your team. Those are your guys, and you want them to be successful. And I think that these video games quite often do have the effect of sanitizing that history and making it okay. I mean, I play one of the games that I love to play is War Thunder, which is very similar to World of Tanks. They're both kind of the same thing, and you basically, it's one of these like level up your tank, and you drive around in vehicles and try to win. And have a great time being told like by 14-year-olds I don't know how to be a tank commander. But there is an amazing correlation between people that drive around in German World War II tanks, and their username is like Panzer 88 or like Iron Cross 45 or Rommel's awesome. I mean, like it's not just that you're like, I'm just gonna drive around. I mean, like there's a personal embodiment there that goes beyond just choosing a type of hardware, to roll around the battlefield, the sort of virtual battlefield in. And so I think that it is really important. And it on the one hand, yeah, absolutely. I mean, we can't throw all video games out the window for historical accuracy elements. But Kevin points out really well in his video that in his specific instance, the Company of Heroes game, it falsifies history in ways that seem designed to deflect from the fact that you're, for example, playing the Waffen SS, right? I mean, like, rather than just being historically accurate, it's actually making some editorial decisions that seem to be, have an ulterior motive. And so I think it is important to consider, what these games, the kind of history these games are presenting. And I'll give an example because I was looking through the comments too, because the comments are brilliant, scare quotes. And one of them is actually refers to the game that I play a lot, which is Sniper Elite. And Sniper Elite's a first person, but you're always the playable stuff is you're basically always an allied person, whether you're a special operation executive or whatever, and you go around doing missions that help the Allies win the war and shooting Nazis. But somebody wrote on that, Sniper Elite Axis invasion mode is very enjoyable. You invade the single player campaign of another player, but you play as an Axis sniper. And it's true, you can do that in some of them. And I think it's awful. Like, why do you want to become a Nazi and jump in and try to kill I mean, again, like, what does that mean? Is it just like to play the bad guy, or is there something else there? And I'm not suggesting the people that play the Axis are Nazis, but maybe they need to think about why they've made that choice and what that choice really represents if you follow it sort of all the way through to its sort of logical extreme. And I'll pause there, but I have lots of thoughts on this because I think video games can do great things for history and they can do terrible things for history. Like an example of the great things is I'm a big fan of the Assassin's Creed games because they really, at a basic level, really do dig into history. And for the most part, the ones that I've played, I kind of get it right. I think like this is a bit off track, but I mean there's a Black Sails version, which is basically piracy in the Caribbean, but they have Tainos, so they have like native indigenous peoples who are portrayed in a very respectful way, and actually mentions the Western European mass atrocities and genocides against them, that kind of stuff. So I mean, I think it is possible, but it's also possible to go the other route as well. And I'll shut up, but I'll let Kevin talk. But I think it's important.
Well, I divide games into two categories in my brain. So there's abstract games which don't care about the why. So I think War Thunder, which I've played myself, is an amazing example of an abstract game because it doesn't try and tell you it. See, I don't have a problem with people not telling you things. It's people telling you things wrong is the bigger problem I have. So I think War Thunder is a completely abstract game. And because of that, I have no problem with it because it doesn't, it's just, it's just tech. And I think you have to be particularly close-minded to not agree that though the Nazis are horrible, they had some cool machines. Whether they're cool because they have a certain menace about them, or because they're big and they're complicated and they're heavy and they've got big guns, or because they're mad like that that rocket interceptor that has to glide after flying for a minute. They've got loads of mad and wondrous technology, and I think if you like that because it's fun, then that's cool, and I don't think that that's a problem. So that the reason, the place when I think it's a problem is when it's a narrative game. So Company of Heroes, the series, they try and tell a story. So they try and suck you into the game with a story because they think that will basically make you more engaged because, people like stories. People always love stories. And so, but when those stories aren't realistic, I look at the game in the same way you'd look at, say, the film Enemy at the Gates. When I was young and I didn't know anything about the Second World War, I thought that they were sending them over the Volga with one man with a rifle and one man with a clip of ammo, and then mowing them all down with their only machine gun when they tried to retreat. Because that's what, I don't teach the Eastern Front in school in the UK, and that was the first experience I had as I don't know how old I would have been, like in the late teens or something. And the second Company of Heroes game basically just copies the film. So that's when I have a problem, is when you're telling a narrative story, yet your narration is wrong. So in the first Company of Heroes that I looked at in the video, there's plenty of scenes between a guy and his brother, and it tells a story, and then his brother dies, and it's really sad. And he's trying to encourage his brother not to give up the fight, and he says, if we lose now, then what was all this for? But it never goes any further. It makes it look like the characters are trapped in a war that they didn't choose and they didn't start, and then no one asked the question, okay, if you're just defending the fatherland, why are you in occupied Holland? Like, I don't ever remember Holland declaring war on Germany at any point. I don't think they ever even did at any point during the whole war.
We'll flood our country if we're angry.
Yeah. So, there's it. And I said, like the example I gave in the video, if it just switches out the SS units and the SS commander, and it switches out, what's that guy's name that they all love? Michael Waitman. Yeah. It switches him out. And because it decides, well, I want my story to have emotional resonance, but I don't think my players are going to feel sorry for this guy when his brother dies if they're both hardcore members of the Waffen SS. They know that the audience isn't going to have sympathy for members of the Waffen SS, but generic German army guy who's been conscripted, and they'll have sympathy for. So I guess that's my real problem, is when they try and tell a narrative and the narrative is wrong. And I feel the same way with anything. I still Second World War. I feel the same way about the film Imitation Game, where they, because of narrative convenience, they essentially make Alan Turing into a traitor because he keeps the Soviet mole's identity as secret and doesn't shop him to protect his own, the secret of his sexual identity. But that, never happened. But to tell the narrative story the film wanted to tell, they made one of Britain's greatest heroes into a traitorous act that he never committed because it was convenient for their story. So that's when I have a problem, because I guess I gauge these, I guess I stack these games up with any media. I hold them to the same standard as I hold a TV series. If Band of Brothers had, Americans running around firing M16s, I would have had a similar problem, because these things are. I guess what I'm really getting to is, if you're portraying it seriously, and Company Heroes does, it's got serious music, it's got serious cutscenes, it's got grim looking faces, it's all dark and moody. It's not Inglorious. It's not Inglorious Bastards. It's not Danger 5. It's not an obvious parody. It's not like an action comic tongue in cheek. It is it presents itself and it says, take me seriously. So I think when something presents itself as take me seriously and then packs itself full of historical inaccuracies, I think that's where I have a problem. If it's abstract and it doesn't try to tell you any story, it just says, here's tiger tanks, they're cool, go and shoot stuff with tigers. That doesn't bother me, even if obviously it does attract some idiots. But you can't blame a game for a few idiots. The same way as you can't blame reenactors because a few of them like to dress as the SS. It doesn't mean that all reenactors are awful. It just means that some people are awful, I guess.
Well, yeah, but just you mentioned reenactors, and that's kind of like Pavlov's dog for me. So I have like a
yeah, I'm sorry. It's only because someone on a different Discord linked an old tweet from you a long time ago about the SS that it jumped into my brain just then.
But it's just, I mean, it is. I mean, I think it is relevant because, again, I feel like if you, lots of other critiques aside, if you look at sort of when someone goes down that decision tree all the way from I need a hobby, ending up at I'm dressing up like the SS on the weekends, which is lots of choices, right, that you're making to get from point A to point B. I think you'll find in the German reenacting community, it's almost inevitably like Waffen SS units, because they have this aura of being amazing, which is actually historically wrong. Again, pointing to some things you mentioned already, but being fanatical is not synonymous with being elite. The fact that you are willing to die in large numbers doesn't actually mean that you're necessarily good at what you're doing. And the Waffen SS are notorious for this. And again, I think it is relevant in the sense that it's gravitating on, it's elevating, it's honoring, it's valorizing a group of people that both from just a standard military history perspective, but also from a history of the Holocaust and genocide perspective, don't deserve to be sort of valorized or glamorized. And I think one of the things you brought up that actually I think is also relevant is this idea of like the sort of pulp comic, and Germany had these things as well, and they were very, very responsible for the general clean Wehrmacht myth, because you could buy in Germany the same kind of, I forget what the British example is. It's a very famous British, like, was it Action Comics or something?
It's something like that, yeah.
It's like amazing stories from World War II, and it's always like commando raids and like stuff like this. And there's a German one too, of that, and then the English sort of version of these. There's a series of books called like Panzer Aces and Infantry Aces and all this stuff, and they're just very, very clean, sterile, focused. This battle was amazing, and this guy killed 25 tanks with his anti-tank gun, and da 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 da. But popular culture is important, and it's important in either destroying or perpetuating some really dangerous myths. And I think again, this is one of them. And just going through the comments on the video, it's a masterclass in clean Wehrmacht. Like most people disagree with what Kevin was saying, do so by literally spouting off clean Wehrmacht stuff. Like there was a guy that was like, well, actually, I heard somebody say that it's not really frontline troops that commit atrocities, it's the rear area guys, or what, and it's absolutely not true in the context of World War II, and the context of the Wehrmacht. The Wehrmacht was directly and solely responsible for the murder of 3.3 million Soviet prisoners of war. Like they own that 100% completely, and it was their initiative, and they had control of it, and these things are undisputed. It's not well known by a lot of folks, but it's true, and I think it gets back to the narrative that Kevin was talking about, because even the operational orders from a lot of different units are not. I mean, some of them mention Jews or mention fighting to destroy the Bolshevik Jewish whatever by conquering the city. I mean, like, and obviously you're never going to see that in a video game, but it would not be historically inaccurate, to see that, or if there was an anti-partisan, mission in some game, and so I think Kevin's 100% right. I mean, like, when it's a narrative, when you're telling history, I think you have an obligation to tell it correctly. Doesn't mean academic with footnotes and like citing scholarship, but it does mean getting the broad strokes right about, you know, who is who is good, who is bad, what are we fighting for? And I think one of the things that one of the questions that Kevin's video sort of asked that's I think important is, what do we do when we find that the answers to those questions are deeply uncomfortable? Is it we just dumb them down or erase it, as he showed that Company of Heroes does in a certain way? Or do we say, well, you know what, actually this is really bad and uncomfortable, and maybe we just shouldn't have this as an option? Maybe we shouldn't let you play, as the SS, because it's just, if we're going to be honest about what it is, what it means, maybe this shouldn't be a thing. And I'm happy to turn that back on the United States. I mean, if we had some kind of Company of Heroes analog that was the Indian Wars, on the Western Plains, I think there'd be some serious questions about how do you portray that, and what's your mission, in this particular, and is that something that we want to have as a playable role? So I mean, I think, again, I think that with great power comes great responsibility, I suppose. And a lot of these video, dynasties and franchises, they get lots of people, and I think that's great. And I think if playing a video game gets you to think about or want to learn more about the history, that's great. And I don't expect it to get into the super nuanced history that a history book will get into. But I also think it shouldn't steer you in the wrong direction, in terms of how you approach the past.
I'll just add something to that quickly. My theory on this is that you don't need to go into much detail in video games. I think you need an incredible amount of subtlety, because I think that people, when they play a game, they don't want to be preached at. So, as an example, if you were playing a campaign as a German character, you wouldn't show the worst atrocities because it wouldn't be suitable for the video game. But you could have, maybe your companion has to leave for one mission because he's been ordered to assist the intersect group. And it doesn't need to tell you what they are or what they do, but it just puts a thought in someone's head, and they'll think, well, what is that? I've never heard that word. What do they do? And then after the game, a few of those people will go and Google, and they'll go and learn. Because I think that you can't ram, when you're doing something not for history, you can't ram lessons down people's throats, because they'll just reject it and they won't listen. But you could just have subtle little clues, things, little questions that don't get answered, leave dangling threads that make people think about things, like, why did that soldier take that woman into the house in Italy, and why has she now got enough food when she didn't before? Do you know what I mean? Like a few little bits like that.
I mean, another thing I think you could do, and I'm not a game designer, but one of the things that I've, from the little I've played the Company of Heroes kinds of tactical games, there's no civilians on the battlefield. There's no choice about, this house is full of civilians. Do I attack it? Do I bomb it? And if I do, what are the benefits and negatives for my side in doing that, right? I think adding those kinds of decision points, almost like some games you can play now and sort of like Star Wars or whatever, like based on the sum of your choices, you either sort of go to the dark side or don't. Like it sort of changes. It changes the way you're. I mean, I think you could do that. And I think again, I haven't played Hearts of Iron a lot, but at least in that game, when you're playing sort of the Germans in the fascist period, and you're making choices, and it's like, it literally says, like, do you want to repress the population? It'll give you this, but take away from this, and that kind of thing. And I think you could, and again, not just talking about Market Garden. I mean, in a larger context, particularly, and this is, sorry, one more aside. again about the way that wars are treated is the Eastern Front, which is where the bulk of Nazi atrocities take place, but also where the bulk of Nazis fought, doesn't make it in as much into sort of these games as the Western Front. And probably that's partially because when you want to play the good guys, you want to play the British or the Americans, whatever. So there's this gets to sort of the commercialization piece that I recognize people are trying to sell games. But if you were say again, if you were perhaps playing the Germans on the Eastern Front, there could be something about how you treat this local population, and if you treat them well, you get intelligence, and if you don't treat them well, you get resources, but it has a negative in some other way. And again, I mean that's not a perfect sort of way to present the ethical decisions about treating civilians or killing them, but it is a way to at least bring that into the equation, which is a way of sort of complicating the sort of red icons versus blue icons in a sort of sterile terrain board, which is kind of what you get in a lot of these games. And again, I recognize the part of that's by design. I mean, like we can't have a perfect representation of the fog and friction of war, but
I think that's a really good point, though, because I think that's actually a really strong point, because if you think about it, those questions, especially with your example, let's say, you're the Germans, Nazi Germany, you invade Ukraine. Why don't you turn up as liberators? And then suddenly you've got millions of Ukrainians on your side because they didn't have any love for the Soviet Union. And then people might ask the question, well, why didn't Nazi Germany do that? And then they might learn something, because, that's one of those what ifs that people like to say about the Second World War, but it's based on the fact that it could never happen, because there wouldn't be a war in the first place if that could, if that could happen. So I think examples like that might actually be even cleverer than, they are on a, at their base level, because they make you ask questions because obviously some people are just, blissfully ignorant and never care to learn anything, and they'll just breeze through life. But, you can't help those people. But people that are average and intelligent and like to know the answer to questions might wonder those things. And I think giving them threads like that to follow is I think, the best thing you can do in a game, within the media.
I mean, and there are historical precedents for this. I mean, there were two commanders, for example, in the Balkans, two German commanders, and they were told that if a partisan or one of their soldiers gets killed, they could carry out a reprisal, of whatever they want. One person equals 30 German one German equals 30 civilians you can kill or whatever. And literally, the guy that went to the highest, the 0 to went to 100, got promoted. And the guy who didn't got relegated someplace else. And so, like the German military itself rewarded brutality and cleaving to sort of lots of these racial and ruthless worldviews. And you could I think model that, if you're sort of like, if it's kind of a progression game where, like, on the one hand you can get like career points if you're particularly brutal to civilians, but on the other side, it might have limitations and drawbacks, as we sort of talked about, where you get less intelligence, or you get people sniped at in the fields. I mean, you could do this, I think, in a way that, I mean, again, it probably raises issues about if the game is now encouraging you to commit atrocities. But I mean, again, that's the reality. The reality is that the German military system, rewarded those kinds of people. And certainly the SS did. And so again, I mean, there are sort of two. There's like the ultra reality question, and there's is it ethical to have that ultra reality in a video game, I suppose.
Actually, I wanted to pop in real quick, because I remember, if I remember correctly, in Company of Heroes, there are medics. You can build like a aid station, then medics come out and they collect wounded or injured soldiers from the battlefield, bring them back, and eventually you get a squad.
Yeah.
But if you play as a sniper, you have the option of targeting these medics. So you can shoot the medics, which is a war crime. You're not supposed to shoot at medics. But this is a option that they implemented. So the designers did think about having this option of having the possibility of committing a war crime. But in this case, it seems like it's a very surface level atrocity, which can be excused as something that happened on the battlefield. But they could have perhaps pushed it further and included something where you harm civilians or.
Well, they actually did in the second game, because the campaign in the second game is from a Soviet point of view, and there are two different places where you essentially murder civilians. Because when the Company of Heroes team represent the Soviets, they pretty much represent them. Honestly, it's just as bad as the clean Wehrmacht myth, but from the opposite route. It's like Heinz Guderian had a writing credit on that game. Honestly, that they portray the Soviets as completely ruthless, evil, brutal. As part of the Scorched Earth campaign, they burned their own citizens out of buildings, and in one battle, when some Germans are trying to break out, the Germans have got civilians mixed in, and you mow them down as well because your political officer tells you to. And their whole story in that game is essentially, the lead character is asking, why are we fighting the Germans? We're just exchanging one tyranny for another. And they don't at any point mention the fact that they're defending themselves in a war of literal annihilation. They
in which they're not the aggressor.
Exactly. And and there is no mention at any point in that game that the Soviets are under that level of threat. They just made it out to look like a war between Stalin and Hitler. They don't portray the Soviets as like I said, literally defending themselves in a war of extermination for a lot of them.
That's another place where you could do something that's even more sort of purely military, but you could deal with POWs, right? Like when you capture the objective, you take X number of POWs. Like, do you feed them and treat their wounds, which would have some cost to resources or something, or but maybe some kind of benefit as well, or do you just let them die, which is what actually happened, right? And that might have some benefits as well in the gaming sense, and so you could even model those kinds of things, much like Samuel's idea of with or example of the snipers, where it is a choice you're making, and you could ask yourself, well, I have these POWs, and if I feed them, it's going to limit my movement, or it's going to take away from resources. But if I kill them, it's going to have this other effect, whatever. I mean, it's something that could be put in there. But again, I suspect the game designers are kind of like, we don't really want to.
I think it's just too complex. I think that's the problem. Is like, in my limited personal opinion, the only way you can really deal with the Second World War in a narrative way in a game is you have to keep your parameters really small. You have to tell very small stories, small slices of history that happen to small groups over a short time, or you go big macro and you just, Hearts of Iron, it's just chaps on maps. And that's the, because you can't do anything else because there's too much to fit in the game. And the more you start mulling over possible mechanics, it sounds like a parody, like, oh, well, you want to save as many POWs and do this because then, at the end of the game, when you're at Nuremberg, you don't get you don't get hung. And, that it just becomes like a parody of the situation rather than, an honest portrayal of it. So I think the war is too big, too varied, too detailed to tell anything other than a tiny slice of it within the context of a video game. I mean, if you look at most war films, they tell a tiny story, a unit, a company at most. I mean, even something like a bridge too far details an operation that took, what was it, 2 weeks in Arnhem or something? Like it on the scale of the Second World War. It's, although it's big for, if you're Dutch or British, it's a big moment, but for it can, compared to the Eastern Front, it's a day. It's a day on one front for one army, and therefore, these, I think telling these things is it's just too big. It's too big to get any of the nuance in it.
Just to provide a counter argument and to hear what you think about this. For example, there's the Sur Adur massacre. SS unit massacred a bunch of French civilians as they were retreating because of an attack that had happened by the French resistance. For example, in Company of Heroes, you're playing as a fictional, almost SS unit. This is a mission that you could implement, I think, relatively easy. That would do justice to both the historical past as well as provide an option in the game as a mission.
Yeah, I think that's the only way you can. You can't show. The problem is you can't demonstrate the systemic and scale of it, but you can show individual events if they're relevant. And I think that would be the only way to paint some reality in, is if you were focusing on a small slice of history, and that history did contain some notable events like that, then I think you could get away with that portrayal. But and it wouldn't convey the scale. But then again, I don't think it needs to, because it doesn't try. As long as the game is set in a small, as long as it all makes sense, I guess. I think the problem is that, I think really what it comes down to is the video games that people like us grew up with. They're all written by people that grew up in the Cold War. The general understanding of history back then, of things like the clean Wehrmacht myth, and also the knowledge of the Soviet Union, was pretty poor. And I think that's essentially half the problem. And I think maybe if someone tried to make one of these games today, we would actually see a bit more nuance. I've heard some of the more recent, I think, Battlefield games have actually had, I think there was a Tiger campaign in one of the Battlefield games that's been quite highly praised as actually showing a bit of nuance in a small story about, while still playing a Nazi Germany soldier. So,
well, I think also, just to play sort of the other extreme of it, is, you know, if you don't have an option to play the Nazis, what is that? What do you lose, right? I mean, because okay, you can't play the Nazis. They're the bad guys, and that's who we fight. And then it sort of makes people, in their mind at least, even if they're upset, have a discussion with themselves about why they are just dying to play the Nazis.
I think the way to do it is, because I don't think you should ever have any rules. Like, developers should make the games they want, and we should mock them if they're rubbish. And I think that the problem is, though, they should respect history. And I think the problem is, if you do respect history, no one's going to want to play the game that you make where you're a member of the Waffen SS, because it's just going to be too unpleasant, because the reality of that is horrid. But I think you could be clever, and you could probably make your main character maybe someone a bit more sympathetic. Maybe you're a enlisted, is it an Ost battalion member? Like some of the really wonky troops they had in the Normandy defense sectors, and some of the more pressed soldiers that aren't even from Germany, or some of the conscripts from some of the maybe the Baltic states and places like that. Someone who's not a hardcore SS.
I mean,
I
I don't
think
know.
maybe.
I guess I have a problem with any attempt to sort of make the Nazis more agreeable to play. I mean, I think that I almost think if you're gonna choose to play the Nazis, you need to just own it and and realize and be told essentially that you're. I mean that may be an idealistic perspective, but trying to find a sympathetic character in the Wehrmacht, um, I think actually does is really awful, because what it does is it's 1,000% a reification and a reinforcement of the clean Wehrmacht myth.
Well, I think
The idea that
what you need to
most of the people were good or sympathetic, and they were forced, because you certainly can find folks that are just some guy that gets drafted and ends up stuck on the Eastern Front, and doesn't really, maybe doesn't even agree with the Third Reich, maybe whatever. Um, but the problem is that whenever same thing is true in movies, or film, or whatever, or any other sort of media. Um, when you focus on that person becomes the story, and then someone walks away from the game thinking, well, I was just the guy that actually was against the Nazis in his heart and got drafted, and it just suffered, and it was awful. Whereas that may be true, and it may be completely realistic in that one instance, but that instance then becomes the entire game.
I think it's okay if all the people around that character are realistic. So it depends. It depends if your game features like one person or 100 people or 1,000 people. Like if your game features a lot of people and they're all average Nazis, and you are an exception for some reason, as long as it's understood why you're the exception, I think that's probably, because the problem is people are always going to want to play as Nazi Germany, because, well, some people just have no feelings at all. They just don't care. They don't know anything. And some people are just, like they say, you can't look away from a car crash. You know what I mean? Some people have this just like weird thing where they want to be they want to do the weird, they want to experience it from the weird point of view, or they want to do the thing that they know is the non thing. And also, there's some people that are just, they they have this weird obsession where they see Nazi Germany as the underdog, and they want the underdog to win, which is, I know it's a very weird viewpoint, because
Yeah, but I mean, I think again, I think you're being very kind, and I appreciate that. But like, if you're the guy that thinks the Nazis are the underdog and wants to play them to see if you can win, I think you need to sit with that. I mean, like,
you'd be Italy or something. Well, you'd be Italian, wouldn't you, if you were going to be the underdog or something like that?
But I mean, it's and again, like I'm perfectly happy to turn this back on myself. I mean, like there are American Civil War games, where it's the same thing. Everybody wants to play the Confederate States because they're this underdog, etc. But they're also a white supremacist organization fighting to, it's not just to keep, but to spread slavery. I mean, like, and I guess I think you got to sit with the fact that it's not like you're the bad guys in Command and Conquer, or like in some fictional universe where you just want to be like the dark, you want to be like the Sith in the Star Wars or whatever. I mean, like, okay, I mean that's fantasy, but this is actually real people, with a real history, and I mean, and then you end up at the bar, talking about how the Nazis weren't that bad because you learned it in a video game. And you may not say it that directly, but I learned, for example, this is not the same, but I learned about different prototypes of tanks that exist from War Thunder, and I can say, yeah, there was this weird like T-28 American tank, blah blah blah, and that's actually true, and isn't ideologically problematic, but I could totally see someone saying, oh, actually, most German soldiers weren't, ideologically motivated, or weren't involved in atrocities or whatever, and citation, company of heroes or whatever.
Yeah.
Sorry, I probably went off too long.
All right, no, I think it's a perfect moment for us to, unless Samuel wants to say anything else. No, yeah. So I think it's a perfect moment. Do you want to say something, Kevin?
No, go for it. Go for it.
Yeah. to bring the argument that from the public. Um, I think it's one of the arguments we read the most in the comments, and this one particularly came from a stories I recorded last week. And I said in this video that is there any moral problem with playing with the axis? And that was the question I made. And I didn't actually invite people to talk, but people sent me messages. And I think this one is a valid one for us to discuss here. Let me read it for you, and then you tell us what you think about it. So it says, we should be allowed to play as Axis. There should be missions on Axis side as well. How are we supposed to learn history if we only learn one side all the time and constantly demonize Axis? That's biased history. World War II history is always politics. People can learn battles, strategies, technology, and design. Only way people learn history is with no censorship and stop demonizing and just say Germans are evil and Americans are good. I think we discussed a little bit about it, but that's
I
the
think
spearhead.
I mean, you should be able to play whatever you want, and there should be never any legal restrictions on what developers make like that. You know, if they want to make a game where you play as the Axis for the whole game, then they should, because the moment you start restricting things, things go underground, and then it all gets weird. So I'd never be up for that. But I think the problem is, it's okay to say we should be able to do that, but the reality of it is, it would be so horrible in many cases to portray it realistically that no one would play the game anyway. So it's a self-defeating request, because if you were telling a personal story, let's be kind, really, really kind, and forget the Eastern Front and just focus on, I don't know, Sicily, Italy or something, right? Even if you were telling a story about the Wehrmacht in Italy, and you were trying to show both sides, we're still talking about, executing civilians and claiming they're partisans. We're still talking about, destroying all the food and water supply as you retreat so that all the civilians have to starve. You know, there, there's nothing, there's no fun in that in a playable sense. So although technically, yes, you should be able to play them. I don't think that game would be made, because I don't think anyone would want to play. It'd be in the old days when games were easy to make and you only needed one or two people. Every 5 to 10 years, some white supremacist group would make some Holocaust or some concentration camp simulation game, because there's sick people out there and they want to do these things, and obviously no one would sell it, no one would buy it, no one would play it apart from a handful of sick white supremacist weirdos. But they don't do that anymore, because games are really complicated to make, and you can't be generally white supremacists who believe in the good, who believe that the Holocaust was a good thing. They're not normally smart enough to learn things like game development. So you don't get those games anymore. And I think it's kind of a similar thing, if you were to really make a game that properly portrayed the Wehrmacht and the things that, because even if you forget about the proper shootings and you just look at the whole point, you send a massive army into the Soviet Union, but you don't give them any food because you want to keep everyone at home well fed. So you just rely on them stealing the food from all the native civilians, who will then end up dying anyway. Even just their very presence in that country, even if they'd never shot anyone, would still have resulted in millions of deaths, just because you can give a peasant family a fistful of occupation dollars or whatever they had, but they can't change that for food, and if that was their only food, they're going to starve. So I think that's the problem. I agree with the argument in principle, and which I think is why it's fine to have games like War Thunder, where you're looking at, you don't have any story. You're looking at, just like things taken, abstracted out. You're looking at, tigers and panthers, or you're looking at Messerschmitts and Heinkel's and all those kind of things. But as far as like narrative stories that tell, like let's say you were going to tell a month in the life of a Wehrmacht officer or something, I don't think anyone would play the game. I don't think if it was, they'd only play it if it was sanitized. And if it wasn't sanitized, it would be no fun. Apart from obviously a tiny proportion of weirdos, but you have to ignore them because they're not going to buy enough copies of a game to keep a developer in, in production.
I mean, I agree, but I will say there is a Call of Duty mod that is defend Auschwitz as the Germans from the Soviets, which is kind of awful. But I also think that there's a lot of sort of red flag buzzwords in that comment. The censorship. I mean, I agree. I'm anti-censorship. I think you should be able to sort of say what you want, and then freedom of expression does not equal freedom from consequences. And so if you say something or do something awful, then you should be punished for it. Just the government shouldn't be able to tell you what to do with it in that sense. But I will also say that if we're again talking broad strokes, I don't think it's demonizing to say that the Nazis were the bad guys in World War II. I don't think that's a biased historical conclusion, right? I mean, yes, if you say every German soldier was a drooling, bloodthirsty Nazi killer, then yeah, now you're biased and you're sort of not being historically accurate. But I also don't think in relation to that comment that it's censorship or it's bias. To me it strikes the teach both sides kind of nerve. Teach both sides of the Holocaust, or what's the other side to that? It's they're yeah, we teach about the Nazis, but we don't teach from the Nazis' perspective, right? And it sort of sounded like that comment was sort of saying, if I can't play from the Nazis' perspective, then how am I going to learn about whatever about history? And again, I also agree that you shouldn't if you want to learn about how the German army fights in World War II, your go-to, and just call me old man shouting at clouds, but your first stop should be the library and pick up a book about it and read about it. You don't expect a game designer who has lots of other competing interests, but also logistical and realistic constraints to teach you a history. I think Kevin's point is a good one, that we're not necessarily expecting them to give us a college level class in history. We're just expecting them not to do it wrong, not to present intentionally bad history, particularly when it comes to sort of whitewashing the baddies. But in this modern political context, that sounded a lot of red flags just in general about people talking about censorship and both sidesism and bias, who don't really understand that the facts have historical bias. I mean, the facts are that the Nazis are bad, and I don't think that's controversial, and I don't think that's biased to say that they are the bad guys. And if someone telling you that the Nazis were the bad guys makes you feel bad about wanting to play them, again, this is a great time for self-reflection about why that is, and whether you should feel bad or not. But again, and I think, to go to Kevin's point, and again, this is just kind of riffing off what he was saying earlier as well, which is good. Okay, so let's say you play the Allies all the way through, or sorry, you play the Axis all the way through. So what happens if you win Poland? What happens if you win the Battle of Britain? Okay, so are we now occupying England? And it almost then takes you into a worse place for the game designers, who then have to kind of figure out an imagined Holocaust in England, or an imagined mass atrocities in England carried out by the Nazis if they win, kind of thing. And I think it goes back to the question that we sort of talked about at the very beginning, which is, if you win as the Nazis, what have you won, actually? I mean, right? I mean, you've killed a bunch of, in this case, Americans or British or Polish soldiers. and you have, kept. Kevin does this really well in the video. You perpetuated the war for however long, rather than if Market Garden in this example had been successful, or if you throw the Allies back into the ocean at Normandy, does that give Germany 3 more years before the Allies can come back to do all the things they've been doing, that are awful? I mean, it just, and it's not even playing it 20 steps down the road. It's like 1 step down the road,
The Market Garden is the thing that always I think about, because if you were playing the Axis in a game, you'd think you'd want to lose that mission on purpose, so that maybe the Soviets would be a lot further away from Berlin when things went down. So that's the problem with all the counterfactual answers like that, is they're almost absurd. The whole, when you start thinking about, okay, you're trying to win, what does it even mean? And and then if you try and take little sanitary bits out of different bits of the campaigns, because it's even in the desert. I mean, at least with the desert fighting, there was not many civilians living there, so things could have been a lot worse. But it's hardly as clean as people like to think. I mean,
but there were still atrocities against civilians there.
Exactly. I mean, it's, even if you look at the most, you look in the sea, and you've got all the unrestricted submarine warfare, and you look in the air, and you've got there's nothing. There's no. I don't think there's any sanitized point you could take and say, really, do you really want to win this? Because then and the earlier in the war that you win, so even if you try and show you show the first, German defeats, like you said, the Battle of Britain. If Britain gets knocked out, and that's terrible, because then, the Soviet thing works and they do the General Plan East, or maybe if they suddenly start winning some victories, and because as far as my limited understanding is, the closer they get to defeat, the closer you get to the end of the war, the more the Holocaust ramps up. It's almost like a rush to the finish line. So delaying the final surrender by 6 months is millions and millions of people. And I think the other thing, when it comes down, this is another point, I think something we mentioned earlier when it comes to scale, is when people always have that 6 million number in their head because of the Holocaust, and they think Nazi Germany killed 6 million. But when you look at the war in a whole, and the amount of people the amount of lives that whole war claimed, that's probably 10% or something like that. And so every month that war goes on is millions of people dying. And I'm sure, because I like to be positive, there's got to be someone out there who's an exceptional game designer and an exceptional storyteller, and could somehow find a way to navigate all of this and tell an educational and excellent game that doesn't do any wrong. But that's not the game designers I've played games from, and none of the games that have been made. So as far as that earlier question goes, technically, yes, show both sides, but in reality, you're not going to find that unless we have like the Picasso of Second World War video games somehow comes and creates a masterpiece that navigates the most treacherous of waters. So I mean, I like the sentiment, and I guess I know where it comes from, because I think what's really exceptional about the Second World War is there is a baddies that's clear. Most other wars, especially if you've lived in the modern times, wars are horrible and complicated, and there's normally lots of fault on both sides. But if you're going to fight, if you're going to pick one war that has goodies and baddies, it's got to be the Second World War, right? I mean, I can't think of in my personal knowledge, I can't think of a more clear cut thing. And if someone thinks that, well, if we could tell the real story of Nazi Germany, I just don't think that real story is there to tell. I think the real story is the obvious story that it was a horrific, genocidal, murderous regime that was defeated by a coalition of people that did it because they thought it was the right thing to do. I mean, if you that's what I found remarkable about reading a lot of memoirs from people that aren't British or aren't American. They're like, there's people from like tiny Caribbean islands that were like a British colony that had no duty to fight. Yet they got on a boat and they sailed across the sea and they joined the RAF because they could see that even they from 5,000 miles away could see that Nazi Germany was evil and had to be destroyed. And yeah, and yes, I remember reading about that one battalion, or was it a division from Brazil? Yes.
Yeah, the Brazilian Expeditionary Force, 25,000 Brazilians fighting in Italy for democracy and
what were they
freedom.
called? They had a funny name, right? Like a pigs might fly kind of name, didn't they?
The smoking snakes. They
Yeah, the
said
smoking
that,
snakes. Yeah.
yeah, the only way for Brazil to go to war would be when
when snakes smoke. Yeah. So yeah, I feel that I get the sentiment because obviously I think some of it comes from young people that have grown up in a media time where you do have to be a bit funny about what people tell you. Everything's very politicized these days, and you do have to be a bit careful with. Like when I grew up, you could generally trust what newspapers and news people told you. It wasn't always right, but they weren't doing it for clicks. They were doing it because, the subscriptions and things, but now it's all the most clicks. And so I get why there's a bit more scrutiny, but I think that with this one thing, with the Second World War, you don't need to, there's not two sides to the story. You are, and it's okay. I mean, and if you really believe they are, then you don't have to read much. You really don't have to go very far to find. You could probably read one book and you'd probably be all right. It's really that clean, really that clear cut. I mean, you could just watch the film Downfall and you'd probably have a good idea about what you're dealing with.
All right, guys. So this is basically the end of the episode. All right, so I'm gonna wrap it up. But before we jump to the actual end of it, I want to invite all of our audience, the people who got to this point of the episode, check out our Patreon link. It's only $5, and you can help us. If you don't want to donate money, just subscribe to the channel, and because that helps a lot, and it's for free. And if you change your mind, you can always unsubscribe. The link to Kevin's channel will be in the description of the episode. Be sure you also click it and watch it and subscribe to his channel. I'm going to add the link to your new book, all right, Waitman, here in the description of the episode. The new one and the one we discussed in the last episode, so people can go to episode 7, part 2, and check out the interview with Beorn, which was fantastic, amazing. I keep posting clips from that interview still. And before I shut this down, Beorn, do you want to say your last words, your final considerations, your final thoughts?
I mean, I think we've done a really good job of covering this. I would just I guess I would ask that people playing video games just be conscious and intentional, and think about the choices that you're making, and what they mean, and also consider the history and think about how well it's being told. And I also think that folks that work in this area do have a responsibility to be as sensitive and effective as they can in telling the actual truth.
All right, now I'm going to give the word to Kevin so you can provide us your final thoughts and insights about this topic.
I think we've covered everything I want to say. The one thing I'd say is don't be afraid to read. There's, if you don't know much about the Second World War, that's fine, because there's too much for education to teach you. But it is truly fascinating, and it's not all dry, numbers and divisional movements. There's some really fantastic, accurate narrative histories out there, and go and read them, and you'll be surprised. You think you'll just read a few interesting narrative histories, and then 6 years later you'll be reading thick tomes about the Holocaust. But then you'll learn, and the games are fun, but it's so much better when you sort of know really where they come from.
All right. There's something I forgot. I'm going to put the link to your podcast as well, Born. Okay.
Okay, great.
I forgot to mention that last time, and I feel like it should be there. Invite people to subscribe and join you as well when you in your own show. Samuel, your final words.
I wanted to add that if you want to read a book, I would recommend Bjorn's Marching into Darkness, which deals with the Wehrmacht and the Holocaust during the Second World War. It's a great read. It's a horrific topic, but I also think that it's a very important thing to learn about.
All right. So thank you very much, Kevin. Thank you very much, Waitman. We truly appreciate your time and your knowledge. We are planning to do a second part of this interview soon, so we're going to be contacting you in the future to because I think there are many other aspects to cover and to discuss. I see there's a lot to go over about the myth of the clean hands and pop culture. It's a very interesting mix to debate. All right, people, if you came to the end of the episode, thank you very much. We truly appreciate your time. Don't forget to like and subscribe to this video, and we wait you on the next one. Bye bye. Hey there. Thank you for coming to the end of this episode. I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you want to support our show, the link to our Patreon is in the description of this episode. It helps us a lot. With only $5 a month, you can help us to improve our show and support our mission to get history, real history, as far as we can get it. If you cannot donate $5, that's perfectly fine. Just subscribe to our channel, check out our other social medias, and like this video. It already helps us a lot as well. Okay, all the links are in the description of this episode, and I'll see you on the next one. Thank you.